This program is made possible by the support of longstanding friends who share our commitment at Eagleton to civic discourse and to the thoughtful, open exchange of ideas. And it's with sincere and deep appreciation that I acknowledge the support of the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation, which has been a steady partner with us now for many years. And as I say, I think some of you have heard me say this before. Tonight, we're honored to have with us the Foundation's Executive Director, Jean Korff, and Board Member Scott Korff. And I'd like you to join me in welcoming and thanking them. Not everyone here, although some of you, like me, are old enough to think back to 1996. For those of you who aren't, stay with us for a few minutes, but I'm going to play 1996 a little bit. That was the year that a January blizzard, not the conversations in Washington, D.C., but a January blizzard closed down the government in Washington for several days. It was the year that President Bill Clinton signed welfare reform into law and also signed the Telecommunications Act of 1996, deregulating access to the dissemination of media by internet. It was the year that Barbara Jordan, Ed Muskie, Spiro Agnew, familiar names to some people here, Alger Hiss, Ella Fitzgerald, and for those of you who might remember, someone named John Benet Ramsey died. It was the year that re-elected officials included Bill Clinton and Al Gore, Boris Yeltsin, Robert Mugabe, and Yasser Arafat. The year the Yankees won the World Series and Braveheart won the Oscar for Best Picture. It was the year that News Corp launched a new 24-hour channel to compete with CNN, calling it Fox News. That was also the year that Bill Kristol first spoke at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. And I just showed him a picture that was on the flyer. We have a flyer from that year. He looked slightly younger, so did I, but not a lot. He was one of the first big names I was fortunate enough to snag as the then new director of the Institute. Actually, the exact date of his last visit here was Thursday, February 8th, 1996, 22 years ago, almost to the day. Then as now, we sought out thoughtful observers of politics who brought a variety of viewpoints to a campus where conservative voices weren't always prominent. A few major events have taken place in the world since then. But Bill Kristol remains a thoughtful observer of politics from the right side of the spectrum. That's why we were so eager to bring him back to share his perspective with us today. Bill Kristol, as I'm sure almost everyone knows in the room, is the editor-at-large of the Weekly Standard, which he established almost at that moment back then in 1995. You also know him as a regular on ABC's This Week and on that network's special events and election coverage. He also appears frequently on other leading political commentary shows. Before starting the Weekly Standard, he led the Project for the Republican Future, where he helped shape the strategy that produced the 1994 Republican congressional victory. Earlier, he was chief of staff. That's a position we all know a lot more about today than we did even just a few months ago. He was chief of staff to Vice President Dan Quayle during the first Bush administration and to Education Secretary William Bennett under President Reagan. Before coming to Washington in 1985, Kristol was on the faculty of Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and the Department of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He has co-edited several books and is the co-author with Lawrence Kaplan of the best-selling 2003 book, The War Over Iraq. He earned his undergraduate degree and doctorate from Harvard University. I'm sure our speaker tonight has a lot to say about what's unfolding in Washington these days, and it is with anticipatory pleasure, genuine anticipatory pleasure, that I present Bill Kristol. Please join me and welcome him back to Eagleton.
Thank you, Ruth. It's great to be back. It's a very nice introduction. I'd say of all the introductions I've had over the years, it's probably the one that makes me feel the oldest. So, otherwise, it was great. It's not so good to have been here, spoken here. The last time I spoke here, the students in the audience weren't born yet. So, makes me. But nonetheless, shouldn't discriminate against old people. So, it's good to be here. I have a very high regard for the Eagleton Institute, obviously for Ruth Mandel's work, and for Rutgers, actually, which I've known for. I grew up on the west side of New York, looking out at New Jersey, across the Hudson River. I was here at Rutgers, many friends who taught here over the years, some great political science professors, Carrie McWilliams and others, whom I've known over the years. So it's nice to be able to visit and talk with people, some of whom remember some of those older figures, and many of the rest of you maybe not. Let me be reasonably brief in my remarks so we can have a good discussion and Q&A. Also, I don't really understand what's going on in Washington today, so no point going on at great length telling you I don't understand. I can tell you in one sentence, then we can have all Q&A. The election was a surprise in 2016, and a consequential surprise, I think. So I'll say a word about 2016. Let me go back to the election. Talk a little bit about the current moment, the actual administration that's in power, what might happen over the next 3 years, and then maybe a couple of reflections on broader themes and implications. 2016. One can overinterpret particular elections. Could have easily gone in many, many different ways. There were all kinds of flukish aspects to Donald Trump's victory in the primary, and then especially, I would say, in the general election, where in effect he sort of drew an inside straight, you might say, and won the Electoral College despite losing the popular vote by almost 3 million. It was helped probably by FBI Director Comey's intervention 10 days out, and all kinds of other things happened that were not predictable and are not due to deeper trends. They just were the fluky stuff that happens in popular election campaigns. But things can happen for reasons that are flukish or contingent, let's say, but still have great consequence. And I was saying this in the office shortly after Trump won. I said, people are going to overinterpret this. All the political scientists, the social scientists, the sociologists are all going to study this and explain the deep trends in modern Western society and America. And they're going to have the economists will have economic explanations, and the cultural historians will have cultural explanations, and the students of media will explain it due to the media. And a lot of it is just sort of accidental and contingent. We could easily have ended up with a John Kasich or Marco Rubio against Hillary Clinton campaign, and it would have looked just like 2012 and 2008, and one of them would have won, and we would have politics as usual. So people are going to overinterpret this. And my colleague, a much younger colleague, John McCormick, made a very shrewd point. He said, but things can happen because of for contingent reasons, somewhat accidentally almost. They can still have great consequence. World War I didn't have to happen, right? I mean, a lot of weird things happened between, I'm no expert on World War I, but I will stipulate that it seems like a lot of weird things and accidental things happened between 1911 and 1914, culminating in the assassination of the Archduke. And, things could have gone in different directions if different leaders had made different decisions. But once the war begins, it changes the history of Western civilization. I think that's a better metaphor for understanding both the election, actually, of 2016 and the times we're in than maybe World War II, which is used more, it's more familiar to us, where there's a purposeful sort of dictator, in the case of Hitler, who wants to transform the world in a very bad way, obviously, and sets about doing it and launches, this massive conflagration. But that's not always or even usually the way things work. This feels to me more like a World War I moment where random events can happen, things can get out of control, but you could end up in a very different place than you started. And the big question for me on Trump in terms of the administration, and I'm anti-Trump personally, but I'll just try to be sort of analytical here, is how much difference does it make? I mean, is it a huge moment in modern American political history? Or is it a sort of odd, unusual presidency? Guy kind of gets in for various random reasons, ends up not changing things that radically. People look back and think, well, that was kind of interesting, a little unusual. But at the end of the day, the main trajectory of American history, of American politics, of American life, American economy, sort of goes along as it was. And I think the answer is we don't know. Is it a parenthesis or is it an inflection point? That is, I think, the big question. And everyone has a sense, the reason people are unnerved by the Trump presidency, either enthusiastic about it or very disturbed about it, is they sense that it could be a very big deal. But people also have the sense that, well, maybe not. So far, a year in, economy's chugging along until very recently quite well, actually. The stock market way up, no obvious foreign policy disasters, at least yet. Sort of standard Republican policies, honestly, and appointments in most cases. And so you don't know. I mean, are we being distracted by the surface pseudo-drama of the Trump presidency? Or is the surface drama revealing some really big changes or indicating really big changes below the surface? And the truth is, one doesn't know until it plays out. Both are possible. If you want to think of the metaphors, often you do have a lot of little tremors and nothing ends up happening. And sometimes you have little tremors and they indicate an earthquake's about to happen or is happening. So that's, in a way, for me, the big question. The biggest argument for us being at a big moment, let's call it an inflection point, I think, is this aspect of the 2016 campaign. Donald Trump, a total outsider, never been elected, obviously, to any office, wins the Republican primary, wins the presidency. First man ever to become president in America, who had neither held elective office, nor been a cabinet official secretary, nor been a general in the U.S. Army. America, unlike a lot of other countries, and for better or worse, I mean, I'm not making a judgment about this, but America has been pretty traditional and conventional in the kinds of people we elevate to the highest office. We'll sometimes put a businessman in as governor, we'll put a movie actor even, a Schwarzenegger type in as governor, or Jesse Ventura if you really want to take a fling. Usually that's 4 years, 8 years, and things go back to normal. Reagan, who was an actor but was very politically savvy and engaged, was an 8-year governor before he ran for president and actually only won on a second race. So we tend to value political experience in the presidency. So Eisenhower's the last president who hadn't held elective office, and Eisenhower had fairly major national experience, you might say, and responsibilities before becoming president. So just in that way, Trump is a very unusual experiment for the country to take, and especially an unusual experiment and gamble for the Republican Party, which tends to be, of the two parties, the party that has nominated the most establishment, experienced people who'd been around before, people who had run and lost before, the McCain and the Romneys and Bushes and Doles and Reagan, for that matter. It was a very stable, again, for better or worse, party, really. Trump represented a pretty massive rebellion against the party's tradition, the party's establishment, the party's policies. He attacked George W. Bush's foreign policy. He attacked the Republican belief in free trade. He attacked part of the Republican Party's view on immigration. He didn't have much regard for his Republican predecessors. Reagan, he kind of pretended a little bit, I'd say, to look up to, but he's had contempt for the Bushes, contempt for Dole, Romney, McCain. Again, the normal Republican way is to speak very nicely, even reverently, I'd say, about the people who've come before. So Trump really was a break on the Republican side. But Trump was not the only story of 2016. And for me, the underreported story of 2016 is Sanders. 45% of Democrats voted for Sanders in the primary. against a mainstream Democrat who had almost won in 2008, who was certainly qualified for the job, who would have been the first woman president. It's really astounding, I think, that Sanders was able to get that much support, that people, and again, I really am not making a judgment here for better or worse, I'm just trying to sort of be analytical, that so many people were so unhappy in a way with the establishment choice of the Democratic Party. And Sanders is a pretty radical figure. He's not like, I don't want to compare him to Trump in character or in other ways, but he's a guy who refused to join the Democratic Party in the Senate because he's a socialist, as he says, and he didn't like the kind of corporatism and the concessions the Democratic Party made to free market kind of orthodoxy in the US. So this guy he launches his campaign, what was he already, I think over 70 years old, wasn't he, when he starts to run, never had been elected or run outside of Vermont, suddenly gets 45% of the Democratic vote, running against his own party. What did Sanders attack? He attacked Republicans, of course, but he also attacked the Bill Clinton administration, various concessions Bill Clinton had made that Sanders thought were unnecessary and unwise, attacked the Democratic establishment. Trump runs and attacks the Republican establishment. They each get 45% of the vote in their if you add them all up, in their respective primaries. That shows a level of unhappiness and dissatisfaction with the establishments of both parties and with the political establishment generally that is pretty striking. Surprised me. I mean, I knew there was unhappiness out there, obviously. You've seen it in both parties. There have been plenty of expressions of it. But in a way, one would have expected this in 2008, or right after 2008, maybe, right? You have a huge financial crisis, very difficult war in Iraq. Elites, establishments are somewhat discredited from both parties, perhaps. And you would expect at that moment the kind of populist impulse. And maybe 2016 could be interpreted, historians can work this out, as a kind of delayed reaction to the financial crisis and other failures of 2008 and before. 2008 sort of accidentally had nominated Barack Obama, who was a symbol of change. Republicans nominated McCain, and then the financial crisis hit, and he wasn't the best candidate suited for that. 2012, Obama was renominated. Republicans nominated Romney, maybe not the best guy to nominate from a political point of view if you're have had a huge apparently Wall Street kind of generated financial crisis 4 years before. And so, but I kind of expected more. I think if you'd gone to a historian and said, what's going to happen in 2008? The historian would have said, you're going to see a lot of populist unhappiness with the establishments of both parties in the next few years. And we did see some. Tea Party, Occupy Wall Street, candidates at the state and local level, but not so much at the national level. And I think that's it was sort of bottled up, and it kind of exploded in 2016. And that tells me that there was something deeper than just Trump was an effective candidate and Sanders tapped into youthful unhappiness with being sort of having Hillary Clinton imposed on them. And it's not more than that. So many 30 million votes for Sanders and Trump in the primaries is pretty astonishing. And again, it's not as if the country was in horrible shape, at least on the surface, in 2016. We'd had 7 years of recovery. Not great, not perfect, lots of people left behind, increased income inequality, decreasing social mobility, working class wages stagnating, we all know that. But still, at the end of the day, again, if you ask a historian, if you go to a historian and say, okay, we're having this race, you have Trump on the Republican side, nativist, sort of authoritarian populist, running against his own party's kind of free trade, moderate on immigration, American leadership in the world type point of view, and you're going to have a socialist on the left who's going to get 45% of the vote against Hillary Clinton, also running against free trade and calling Wall Street organized greed or fraud, I think he used to say, and so forth. Like, when would that happen? I think the sociologist or the historian or political scientist would say, well, that'll happen in the middle of a depression, or that'll happen in the middle of a war that's going horribly, like Vietnam, or in the middle of race riots or something. 2016 didn't have any of that for all the problems of 2016, and that's one of the more astonishing things about 2016. And there are two ways to interpret that. One, well, this stuff all was happening beneath the surface. There really is a gulf between elites and the public in both parties. There's really a gulf between young people and older people. Sanders tapped into that. There were all kinds of things going on that were masked by a sort of fairly undramatic surface politics. Or you could take the opposite point of view and sort of say, people worked themselves up into a lather for some reason in 2016. It sort of happens sometimes. And historians look back and say, well, what was that all about? You know, it was like slightly mass hysteria on both sides. I mean, I was in the first Bush White House in '92. We had won the Cold War. We came out of a very mild recession after a very good decade in the 80s. The country was in pretty good shape in 1992. Various laws had been passed, actually, by Bush and the Democratic Congress in 1991. Update on the Clean Air Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act. The country didn't look like a shambles. And people were so unhappy with Bush that his vote collapsed from 54% in '88 to 38% in '92. Ross Perot got 19 million votes as a protest candidate, and Bill Clinton won as the first post-Cold War president. I mean, think about Perot getting 19 million votes, and he's not really a sane guy, so used to be funnier before Trump got 60 million votes, but that's another story. So sometimes, and incidentally, I was there in '92, and we all kind of left the White House on January 20th, '93, and the huge, what does the Perot thing mean? Which party is going to absorb the Perot voters? How do we respond to the Perot voters? And some of that happened. The deficit was addressed more aggressively, and people tried to reach out to some of the unhappiness with the establishments, the Gingrich Revolution on the Republican side, Bill Clinton, very gifted politician on the Democratic side. But the truth is, at the end of the day, by 2000, Perot had kind of come and gone, and it left no great mark. You know, you could write the history of America in the last 30 years, and Perot would probably get a little footnote, really. Even though at the time it was extremely dramatic. He ran as a third-party candidate, independent candidate, and got the most votes since Teddy Roosevelt had gotten in 1912. So it could be that the whole Trump-Sanders thing is kind of just a mood. The country was in a mood for change. It was sick of everything. Various things conspired. I do think the phenomenon of Bush being the front runner on the Republican side, the son of a former president and the brother of a former president, it's never happened in American history. You can be one. You can be the son or grandson of a former president. You can be a sibling or a relative of a president, but to be like the third Bush. I remember saying this on TV in maybe early 2015, one of the few things I got right in the last cycle. I said, I don't think Jeb Bush is going to be the nominee. It's just ridiculous. I mean, it's a huge country, 330 million people, a lot of capable Republicans, and why would they have another Bush? It's like the only country, the only family that can run the country is Bush's, and I remember Jeb Bush was not happy when I said this, and George W. Bush wasn't happy, President Bush, the original President Bush wasn't happy, but I think I was right about that. And then you had Hillary Clinton. I mean, it really was ridiculous in a sense, right? I mean, for Trump in particular, I do think this is underestimated. It's as if he had the absolute perfect, you couldn't do better in a novel or in a TV series, right? It's like, you're the populist, you stand for change, and you get to run in the Republican side first against someone whose brother and father had been in office for 12 years, and then on the Democratic side against someone whose husband had been president for 8 years, and she herself had been also a senator and Secretary of State. The people want change, and the two parties want to give you another Bush and another Clinton. And it helped Sanders as well, but obviously in the general election in particular, I think it helped Trump. I was wrong about a lot of things in 2015, 2016, but I did say during the general election, once Trump won the nomination, that I thought he had a chance to win, and I wasn't happy about this, but I said, I remember being on TV with some Clinton people, and I said, I thought Clinton would win, like most people did. That's what the polls suggested. But I said I thought there was like a 1 in 4 chance that Trump would win, just because when people are in the mood for change, being the candidate of change is good. You have a big wind at your back. And being the candidate of the status quo is difficult. I learned that in '92. And again, George H.W. Bush was not a bad president. The country was not in terrible shape in '92, and people just wanted change, and they didn't want to listen to all of our arguments about how they should be grateful for the Reagan economic boom, and they should be grateful that our policies were right in winning the Cold War, and the Democratic policies probably wouldn't have succeeded as well, and they just didn't want to know about that. There's a little bit of that, I think, in 2016 as well. And maybe Hillary Clinton could have done a better job of being for change, of explaining what changes she would bring about. Maybe the public just, again, wasn't really interested. Maybe they believed too much in the Clinton campaign that they could just disqualify Trump, and that was all they had to do and sort of play it safe. I think there was a certain feeling. And again, it wasn't ridiculous. They almost did. They just didn't. They just fell a little short in 3 states. So 2016 is a big deal. But for me, the 45% for Sanders and for Trump suggests, doesn't prove, suggests that it could be a bigger moment than not. Trump's presidency, 2017 to presumably through 2020, though of course one doesn't know. Well, one doesn't. Presidencies do end early sometimes. Again, that's a very hard thing to figure out, I would say. I mean, I'm anti-Trump, so I fear the worst, I guess. That's why I am very skeptical of Trump and think it's important to sort of keep pointing out the things he does that he shouldn't be doing in terms of, I think, challenging various norms and institutions and the way in which he conducts the office and attacking FBI agents and all the things he does. Having said that, it would be reasonable if you were friendlier to Trump to say, beneath all the Sturm und Drang, what's really happened? I mean, the economy's been good. The market's been, till very recently, very good. No huge foreign policy crises. As I said earlier, kind of standard pretty good judicial appointments from a conservative point of view. Not the best appointments consistently across the board. Some scandals, people coming and going. A lot of big turnover in the White House. But again, at the end of the day, has it really fundamentally affected us as we sit here? Has it affected most voters? Do you drive to work every day and something, the fact that he has creepy people working at the White House, it doesn't seem to affect your own life, really. And I think this is one reason he's held his support. It's also, he hasn't increased his support because a lot of people look at that and think, geez, that can't be the way it's supposed to be. So you have those two things cutting against one another. But it's been a strange first year. You almost feel like it's been kind of a war that's shadow boxing, like a phony war they call the European War from 1939 to 1940 until the Nazis actually invaded Belgium and the Netherlands and France. Britain declared war. They were at war in September of 39, Britain and France against Germany, obviously, with the Soviet Union at that point. But there wasn't much fighting going on after Poland was conquered, a little bit in Norway and Finland. And everyone kind of kept waiting for the war to begin, and it did begin. And of course, it was a major war. So the fact that you have a phony war for a few months or a year doesn't mean that things aren't going to become really crazy at some point. But so far, the craziness has been, you could argue, more superficial than not. I do think Trump's been lucky in certain ways. I mean, I would say in foreign policy, which I'm pretty interested in, the replacement historian, if Trump ends up presiding over a non-disastrous administration, which is possible, I do think historians will look back at the replacement of Mike Flynn by H.R. McMaster as National Security Advisor and say that was a very big moment. And we've all sort of forgotten about it. I mean, we haven't forgotten about it. Flynn's in the news because of Mueller, but I was in the White House. National Security Advisor is really an important job, in some ways more important probably than White House Chief of Staff for all the drama that goes around that job. And I think Flynn as National Security Advisor, you're in a whole different world in terms of our allies being panicked, of people feeling there's no fundamental predictability in American foreign policy. With McMaster as National Security Advisor, Mattis at Defense, I'd say mostly Pompeo at CIA, Tillerson in a way at State, Haley at the UN, you end up with a bit of a mess. I mean, they don't all get along, and Trump doesn't give them very steady direction, but nonetheless, I was in Japan in December, and it was sort of, well, what's Trump up to? And I can't really explain that to you. We don't really understand it either, but McMaster's very good to work with. That was kind of the senior level civil servant take on things. And I asked them, well, do you think we'll make it through the next 3 years without huge, kind of disruptions and real crises? And they were sort of, well, we made it through a year, but hard to know. Is the 1 year the phony war that's followed by 3 years of chaos, or is the 1 year a harbinger that you could have 3 more years of this? I think that's the fundamental question, really, of the Trump presidency, and I think we don't know the answer. I'm worried. For me, the big lessons so far as a kind of political scientist are two. One, the institutions are strong in America. And that's something we should really be grateful for as citizens. Whoever is president, We have a rule of law, we have courts, we have bureaucracies that follow mostly civil service procedures. We have a military that has its own rule of law and strict controls over what can and can't be done and chain of command. For me, one of the most indicative moments of the first year of Trump was when he woke up one morning and, I don't know, was in a bad mood or he wanted to reach out, as he thought, to pacify social conservatives for some reason or whatever. And I remember he tweeted that all transgender people should be kicked out of the military. Or not just should be, I think he sort of ordered in the tweet, so far as you can. They're all going to be kicked out. Whatever one's view, incidentally, on transgender people in the military and women in combat, there are a million policy issues here. I was very struck that I remember being very startled at the time, and it was sort of treated by most people as, well, isn't that a wacky, reactionary view of Trump, or isn't it crazy for him to be tweeting? And I remember saying, I think that morning on TV, this is kind of a big moment. I mean, I don't believe the military will actually obey this. Because, you have to have, there are procedures by which people can be separated from the military. And once people have been enlisted or sworn in as officers, you can't just separate them because the president has changed his mind about certain qualifications or not. There's Congress, there's rules that the military has to proclaim. You have to have notice and comment for rulemaking. There literally are contracts under which people are serving in the military, as you know. And so the president can't just change it because he decides something one morning. But I was curious to see how that would play out. And it basically played out, in that way. It had no effect at all, really, which isn't to minimize. I'll come back to what damage it's done. But that's generally, I think, been the pattern of a lot of what Trump, he now just routinely tweets that, Hillary Clinton should be arrested, or the people should be, they're corrupt over at the Justice Department. The FBI is a political conspiracy to destroy him. And everyone looks at the tweets and sort of ignores him. And the FBI, more or less, so far as one can tell, goes about its business. And the Justice Department more or less functions the way it has, and so forth. So in a sense, and of course we do have a system of separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, that's a good thing. I've noticed some of my liberal friends have relearned the virtues of limits on executive power, limits on the federal government, strong civil society. Rutgers shouldn't be just doing what the federal government wants just because the federal government has this idea or that idea. You want to have separate centers of power in a liberal in the old-fashioned sense, pluralistic society. And we do have that. The founders did a good job, and in setting that up. It's been modified and developed over the years. It's really a good thing to have the federal government not control everything that goes on in the economy, in the society, in the culture, in universities, in the media, and so forth. So the institutions of America strike me as being something we could actually be proud of. If this kind of thing happened in a third world country, not to denigrate third world countries, but I wouldn't mention one by name, but let's just say Argentina or someplace like that, that you would be really worried. Almost the definition of a third world country is maybe not a nice way to say it, but let's say a less developed democracy, is that you get one guy with authoritarian instincts or a populist desire to override the rule of law or step all over the prerogatives of other institutions. You get one guy in power, and he can really make a lot of very bad and dangerous things happen. That's what Juan Perón did, and it's what's happened in Venezuela, happens all over the place, maybe happening in parts of Eastern Europe today. It hasn't really happened, I would say, in America. So that's a very good thing. The flip side is how much damage does all of this do to sort of democratic norms, customs, civility, discourse, the notion that you shouldn't accuse your former opponent in the presidential campaign of being a crook routinely if there's no evidence that she's never been convicted or even tried of being a crook. You shouldn't denigrate people individually in that way. You shouldn't turn the citizens against the law enforcement and intelligence officers of the country unless, if you want to reform FBI procedures or FISA procedures or the CIA, fine. There are cases for reforming all those institutions and procedures. But there are ways to do that, and there are ways to have a responsible public dialogue about that. And what Trump does really doesn't, I would say, help that. In fact, it makes it harder. Someone like me who would be interested actually in some FBI reforms, I now feel, honestly, that you just have to defend the FBI at this point against political interference. Now, that's going to make it harder to actually change things. The FBI is kind of an insular organization that probably could use a little more light and sort of criticism, but not in this context. So how much damage does that all do? I think that's hard to say. And that's, again, something we're going to test over. How strong will the institutions be over the next 3 years? What about democratic norms? Will Trump's manner of behavior become widespread? You can sort of argue that both ways, I think, at this point, and whatever you think of Republicans on the Hill, and I'm very disappointed in them in some ways. They're not standing up to Trump. They don't routinely talk like Trump, most of them, yet. The Nunes memo thing was disturbing for me for that reason. I mean, that a senior committee chairman of what had been a serious committee, House Intelligence, that had been run actually in a reasonably not too partisan way by Democrats and Republicans over the last 10, 20 years, just makes this whole thing a partisan show. There's no pretense anymore of trying to actually responsibly, have oversight of the intelligence community and educate the public about various intelligence matters. It just becomes a partisan, fight, and that's not a good sign if that spreads everywhere else. So, how much damage does Trump do, or to put it more neutrally, just how much does he change the way in which we run our institutions, conduct our politics? How many young Trump-type candidates show up and run and win? Or does Trump kind of sui generis? I think that's a very big question over the next 3 years. There are other very big questions. I mean, Republican Party, does it become a Trumpy party in terms of going right on immigration, anti-free trade, or at least nominally anti-free trade, forgetting entirely about deficits and entitlement reform? I'm old enough to remember when it was a big achievement, actually, of Paul Ryan, younger Paul Ryan, that he got the Republican Party to actually address entitlements, which, again, whatever your views on the merits of the particular proposal, they really are growing, and we really are running big deficits, and we really can't sustain that forever, I don't think. And Ryan got the party to take some politically risky stances. That's all gone out the window. Deficits are now going to go up. Neither party has the stomach to address that. That can't be good, you would think, over the medium and long run. What happens to the Democratic Party? That's a huge question, I think. Very hard to tell at this point, how strong the left is. Again, maybe it's a good thing if the party shakes off its kind of establishment types, Schumer and Pelosi, 70-year-old politicians, and goes much more populist. But we just don't know. I mean, I think it's both parties are in much more turmoil than is usually the case in American politics. And obviously what happens in the world, the economy, foreign policy, all of that's totally, as I say, up in the air. So I think my one piece of advice would be to sort of be very aware of how fluid and problematic and uncertain the situation is. Doesn't mean it needs to end up badly. Just means that we're not. In previous administrations, you could sort of tell where we were going. People liked it, people didn't like it. You could tell what the fights were going to be. You couldn't tell who would win necessarily, but you sort of knew what the kind of battlefield was. It was like two football teams that make it to the Super Bowl and have pretty, both the offenses and defenses of both teams. You know their tendencies. You kind of can figure out how the game might well go. You don't know who's going to win. You don't know exactly what's going to work. And now we're in total unpredictable, more like the first game of a season between two teams you've never seen before, and you're not sure who's good and who's bad, and what plays are going to work and what aren't. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, democracies need to be shaken up occasionally. Turmoil can produce, good outcomes, obviously, and a healthy kind of rethinking of things. But I do think, for me at least, there are ways to do a healthy rethinking that might involve fewer risks than having Donald Trump as president. And I worry about the effect he'll have on the Republican Party. I actually worry about the effect he'll have on the Democratic Party as well. The effect he'll have on our overall public discourse and on the institutions of government. I guess I'll just close with this thought, and then I'll be happy to take comments and questions. I mean, I think we tend, this is a thought about both domestic and foreign policy, when things have been going well or well enough for a long time, one does tend to take them for granted. It's like being healthy, and then you sort of, fine, you're healthy, maybe you don't take as perfect care of yourself as you should, but, basically you're fine, and then, of course, something terrible could happen, God forbid. And that happens sometimes. In foreign policy, we have had a world since 1945 that is appreciably safer, appreciably fewer people killed in wars or killed in horrible genocides than in the preceding half century, and a world in which people have gotten wealthier and lived longer and lived better lives, I think it's safe to say, in many, many cases, than they could have dreamed of in the preceding half century. And we, the US, don't deserve all or most of the credit of that, but we're a key part in that international world order that has prevented major war in Europe, that has prevented major war in Asia, a place that had a heck of a lot of major wars, incidentally. We tend to be Europe, at least my generation tends to be kind of Eurocentric, but if you study in the history of Asia for 10 minutes from 1905 to through the 1960s really, and look at the national conflicts, the internal conflicts, Chinese Cultural Revolution and stuff like that, and then look at Asia for the last 40, 50 years. Plenty of challenges, plenty of problems, but basically, 1 billion people have come out of poverty into something approaching, reasonable working class, kind of middle class lives, real opportunities for themselves and their children. Huge achievement by the world, and achieved by a world in which the U.S. provided the basic foundation of order and of defense alliances that made it not worth most people's while to launch wars most of the time. An international trading system with a free movement of capital, mostly, and quite a lot of movement of labor, which again can have bad effects on people who are thrown out of jobs in a steel mill in Scranton, Pennsylvania, but all in all, allowed an awful lot of people to benefit who were not benefiting before 45 or even 1975. And domestically, I would make the same point. We went through a lot. Civil rights revolution, gender revolutions, sexual orientation revolutions, other, mobility, technological changes. And again, whatever the problems, I think if you step back and say, it's the story of the U.S. from 1970, let's say, to 2015, or even 1990, we won the Cold War in the middle of this, incidentally, is not an unhappy story by world historical standards, And I guess maybe this is just to return to my theme at the beginning, my advancing age or my natural conservatism. But I worry that we now very much have the attitude of let's take a gamble. I mean, during the 2016 campaign, I went to a few Trump rallies, and I was really struck how much people who were not. I mean, I'm sure their jobs maybe hadn't worked out as well as they hoped. Their kids had challenges if they weren't college educated, they were in depressed parts of the country. Still, you looked at them and they weren't, starving or suffering, it didn't seem. And some of them were doing pretty well, actually. And I remember saying to one of them, you really want Trump with all these, are you really a trade war with Mexico? Have you thought about what the implications of that could be for stability? For whatever you think of the border now, let's see what it looks like when Mexico becomes Argentina or Venezuela. And what about our alliance structure around the world? What if that crumbles and dictators really think they can get away with anything? And oh no, that's just, what people always say. And we need to shake things up, drain the swamp, blow up Washington. And it's like, really? I mean, isn't that a little risky? No, couldn't be worse. Things couldn't get worse. And I remember saying, really? I mean, on what planet could things not get worse than America in 2016? We have an awful lot of examples in human history of things being worse than America in 2016, including examples from American history. But people really had that attitude, and it was somewhat true on the left, too, with Sanders, that you could sort of take all these risks. And maybe we can. As I said, the institutions are strong, we're a strong country, and maybe we needed that jolt to really kind of shake things up. But it can also be a jolt that shake things up and they don't settle back in a sensible way, and you just end up with, starting off with a system that has problems, economic situation that has problems, and making them worse. One of the wisest things, this was said by a Hillary Clinton supporter to me, is that the problem, you can't tell people who offer solutions will always beat, a candidate who offers solutions will always beat a candidate who doesn't seem to offer solutions. even if the solutions that the first candidate offers actually make things worse ultimately. But of course, you don't know that till later on. And that was, then I do think, in a way, Trump's genius. Final point, I mean, just the degree, and one reason I think this is probably a major moment where things will get shaken up in pretty major ways, and I trust we'll come through it and we'll reorder ourselves in sound ways, but is all the changes happening at once. I mean, you have globalization, which is a pretty huge thing from a world historical point of view. China and India coming into the world economic system, the world labor force, was going to have huge effects, even if it had been managed more carefully than it has. You just can't have 1 billion people come into the labor, chain of the world, the production chain of the world economy, and not have all kinds of disruptions, and including some people not benefiting from that. You combine globalization with automation, and we all have that sense, I think, from our iPhones and stuff, that the communication changes of the last 10, 20 years really have been qualitatively different, I think, from the preceding 40 or 50 years. It's funny, I was always a skeptic. I've always been a skeptic on this. Things are changing faster than they ever have. I remember being told this all the time when I was a kid. Not a kid, but when I was like a young adult. The 60s was a big 60s, 70s thing. The pace of change has never been faster. And I remember thinking, that's really not true. Actually, I would say that in many ways, transportation, jobs, education, this room probably, this talk, isn't that different from what it was 20, 40, 60 years ago. Of course, there are many changes, but it's actually striking how medicine, I think people had greater hopes for change than have actually happened. That may now be accelerating. But I do think the combination of the internet and the immediate accessibility to the internet and to each other through social media and the iPhone, you put it all together, that arguably is a pretty big change in the way people live. And so you can put that together with globalization, with the gulf between elites and the public, the gulf between the coasts and the center of America, challenges in terms of the foreign policy and the world we live in, kind of a euphoria at the end of the Cold War, which is now faded, and people aren't certain what to do about this new world. And it does seem like a very genuinely challenging time, genuinely unpredictable time. And again, I just would close by saying, that doesn't mean we should be at all despairing or even particularly pessimistic. I mean, obviously, Americans have been through worse than this, to say the least. For all of our worries about working class wages, it's not the Great Depression. For all of our worries about divisions in the country, it's not the Civil War. Today is Lincoln's birthday, actually, and I was reading some Lincoln this morning. I won't read it to you, but I thought, well, gee, I'm going to New Brunswick. I wonder if Lincoln went to New Brunswick. It's actually okay. It's my old kind of historian, political scientist, training. And Lincoln did stop. So Lincoln did this famous trip by train then, obviously, mostly from Springfield, Illinois to Washington. From after he was elected, we launched it, I guess, a few weeks ago, and late January, I think, 1861. Then the inauguration was March 4th, and he went by train to Washington. And he tried to go through a lot of the country to reassure people that, things would be okay. And so he goes to New York, and then he actually goes through New Jersey on a train on his way to Philadelphia. And on February 12th, so on his birthday, which is today, 1861, he actually stops in New Brunswick. So that's the good news. The bad news is he gives a nice speech in Trenton to the New Jersey State Senate and General Assembly, whereas in New Brunswick, he just speaks for like 2 minutes from the back of a train. And they don't actually have they have a newspaper account of it, which is sort of a paraphrase of what he said. So we don't quite know what he said from, I wonder if it was the same train station. It probably was, right? It's probably right there. Anyway, that's my tidbit about New Brunswick and Lincoln. But so he did come through here in 1861 on this day. And, it was on February 21st, I'm sorry. And then he ends up in Philadelphia on February 22nd on Washington's birthday, where he gives a very famous speech in front of Independence Hall. Anyway, Lincoln managed much more difficult things than this. Roosevelt managed more difficult things than this. Other presidents, Vietnam, the riots, those were really huge, huge challenges. Some of the social changes of the last 50 years. It really does come down, I think, to the public and to leadership, and those remain, I think, big questions, but big challenges. I would say to the young people in this room, you have a exciting, few decades ahead of you, and it's up to you to continue the work that your ancestors have done to preserve what Lincoln said was this great and free country. Let me stop with that and take comments, questions, challenges.
We do have time for some questions. Please wait for the microphone and state your name and where you're from.
This gentleman here.
Whom do you see as viable? My name is Leonard Bush. Whom do you see as viable Democratic candidates in 3 years?
The question was who could be viable Democratic candidates in 3 years. I think it's, just an obvious cliche, there's no front runner this time the way there was last time with Hillary Clinton. And also Trump has shown how much you could upset the apple cart. So you put those two things together for the Democrats, and I think you really have a totally unpredictable race. Some people are going to I do think President Obama won in 2008 after 4 years in the United States Senate. Trump won in 2016 after 0 years in elective office. So if you're an ambitious young politician or a businessman or a celebrity or anything who thinks, I don't know, I could do better than these guys, or men or women, I have a distinctive message or I'm from a distinctive group maybe, I'm going to take a shot at it. So I think a lot of people will run. And I really don't have a view. My gut instinct, and this is now entirely just a guess, is it won't be Sanders, Warren, or Biden. I do think I've got to think Democrats would want a younger face, a fresher face in 2020. I think someone will catch on. And who that someone is, it could be one of the people are talking about now, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker from here in New Jersey, Kristen Gillibrand, whoever. It could also be someone we've barely heard of. Let's assume maybe there'll be impeachment hearings in the House, or let's just say, what if some Democratic congressman or woman that we've never heard of is a star of those hearings? That would be huge. That person would be catapulted. Howard Dean, in 2003, in a much more stable climate, people forget he almost won the Democratic nomination. He was ahead. He kind of blew it in Iowa and so forth. He was the governor of a very small state of Vermont. He had a key issue where he was against the Iraq War, and Clinton and Kerry and everyone else had voted for it. Could there be a vote like that in the next few months or years? Sure. There could be a vote to authorize military force in North Korea. There could be a vote to authorize force in Iran. There could be votes on immigration. There could be all kinds of things, right? And you just don't know who could emerge. And I would say here social media probably accelerates everything too, so people can become famous very fast. So you put all that together, it strikes me as a very uncertain prospect. I do think 2018 will be important. I just think the rules of having to have been around for a long time are now out the window, which for someone like me is a little disturbing. I sort of think experience helps. But look, to be honest, Lincoln, whom I mentioned already, one-term congressman, 15 years, 1846 to 1848, I think. So 12 years before he became president. Think of this, ran and lost for the Senate in 1858. To Stephen Douglas. I'm not even sure the Democrats couldn't nominate someone who ran and lost this year if he or she was like a spectacular candidate who galvanized people and lost in a tough state or something like that, but had an issue that was different from everyone else. So I really think it's going to be interesting to watch. Final point, I think the Me Too movement, and whatever one wants to call it, but let's say the increased recognition of the degree of the problem of everything from discrimination and harassment to actual assault, obviously, in the workplace and out of the workplace. I think we haven't seen the end of that or the end of the implications of that. I do think it's a big problem, actually, and I think it's it's all coming to bear now, and you've got to think that, therefore, a woman, maybe a younger female candidate. Hillary Clinton just had a terribly conflicted message as the first woman candidate, but also the wife who defended Bill Clinton and attacked other women, actually, who probably, to be honest, were telling more or less the truth about Bill Clinton. Certainly Monica Lewinsky was. So that was made it harder, and it was a different era. a year ago, therefore it was a whole different era. But I do think that issue could really kick in some unexpected ways. I mean, I'm just making this up, but if a woman were, I don't know, stood up I can't think of the right instance. You don't even have to be an elected official. If you became a leader of this movement, and it's time to fundamentally come to grips with this problem, you could imagine a kind of galvanizing a moment and someone deciding, well, why shouldn't I just run for president? So I think it's really unpredictable, the Democratic side.
A question over here.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Kathy Gleeman, and I'm a former Eagleton employee. During the 2016 elections, there were a lot of people who spoke out against Trump and various things he had said and done. But it seems like after the election, a lot of people fell into line because they were getting what they wanted. So you see the tax cuts you want, you see the judges being appointed that you want, you see deregulation. So people seem more reticent about speaking out against Trump himself. Do you see lines that he can't cross that would force people to say, no, I'm sorry, I just can't take this anymore?
No, it's a very good question. It's something I thought about a lot. I mean, I think the people you're referring to politely in your question are mostly Republicans, and particularly Republican office holders. And I myself have been struck by how much normalizing and rationalizing there's been of Trump. Now, some of it is reasonable, or at least I don't agree with it, but I can see the argument for it. I'm a congressman. My job isn't to be like Bill Kristol, popping off on TV or tweeting or something. I'm elected to represent my constituents. I have certain views on judges and deregulation. I also have very important issues I want to get action on from the Trump Interior Department and the Trump, Commerce Department, and that's all totally legitimate. I mean, that's what congressmen and senators are supposed to do. And so they can talk themselves pretty easily into pulling their punches, let's say, when it comes to Trump saying certain things or even doing certain things, and people like me think, geez, I mean, shouldn't we have a Republican Party that speaks up against this? And they say, well, it's good that you're doing that, Bill, but I've got other things to do. I mean, Charlottesville, I thought, was very indicative, where one thought, okay, well, that's too much. And people did say that's too much. And then a month later, everyone was back in business, incidentally, including the Democrats to some degree. I mean, Pelosi and Schumer had lunch, or dinner, I guess it was, with Trump in the Oval Office. It was right after Labor Day. It was like 2 weeks after Charlottesville. And I thought everyone was supposed to not speak to Trump for the next 6 months. And people were supposed to resign from commissions. Businessmen were supposed to resign from advisory commissions. There was a big brouhaha about that of about 3-4 days. And then everyone decided, okay, we need to get DACA, immigrants handled here, so we need to have a meeting. And I don't criticize them for that. I mean, it's kind of an important issue. If I were Pelosi or Schumer, I probably would have accepted the invitation to the Oval Office. But it has a real effect. How do you tell people you can't normalize Trump when Pelosi and Schumer are having dinner with him and negotiating with him? Well, it's not that they shouldn't. I mean, you can't really tell Pelosi and Schumer not to negotiate with him. He's the president. They want to get legislation through on important issues. On the other hand, it does have this weird effect of making it very hard to sort of say, well, these are real lines that he cannot cross. I think Mueller, so that's one thing. I would say that I am worried that the normalizing and rationalizing, though, does happen. It's kind of a ratchet process, or the frog in boiling water, or whatever metaphor you want, right? Something that you think you would cause the frog to jump out of the water, 3 months later, it's like fine. And I think we've seen that with the Mueller investigation. If you had told me Republicans would be fine with sort of attacking the FBI as a conspiracy to go after Trump and elect Hillary, which incidentally, if you actually know people in the FBI, I would not say that's their, and they're not pro-Trump, but they're not exactly a bunch of left-wingers either, mostly. And anyway, it's so, for the president to be saying these things, and it's so damaging to our confidence in our institutions, and it's so inappropriate if he has proof that someone in the FBI is misbehaving. He's president, He should tell the Attorney General or the Inspector General of Justice or others to investigate these people, or he should remove people, suspend them until they, the case can be adjudicated. Just to be popping off like that is so irresponsible, really. But the flip side of it is he's only popping off. So if you talk to people, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, Chuck Grassley, or Judiciary in the House, Bob Goodlatte, who are both decent people, it's like, well, he hasn't done anything. What do you want me to do? Have a hearing when he has a tweet? And there's a sort of a point to that, So that's, I think, the problem. The rationalization of Trump, I think, So this is how it's happened. I think it doesn't give us clear guidance about when, if at all, Republicans on the Hill or Republican candidates or Republican governors even will really jump ship. Governors have kept more distance because, of course, it's easier for them too. I worry about the rationalization. The one thing I learned, I'll put it this way, those of us who are old enough, to return to my favorite theme of the evening, to have remembered the Cold War, one of the things you learned a lot in college and grad school, in the Cold War, was the power of belief, the power of a kind of irrational wish to believe. Eric Hoffer wrote an excellent book, The Will to Believe. And whether it was fascism or communism, people get seduced by utopian vision, and they sort of put aside doubts, and they put aside common sense, and they fall, intellectuals even, or especially perhaps, fall for these things. And then 10, 20 years later, people look up and say, geez, I can't believe I was sort of seduced by this system of belief. So I think people like me knew about the power of ideology, the power of belief. What I think I underestimated was the power of rationalization. You tell yourself at first, he's kind of a jerk, and I wish he hadn't gotten the nomination, and maybe even the presidency, but he's president, so, I'll call him on the bad things, but let's work with him on the good things. But I know he's not really great, and I'm going to be there keeping an eye on him. Then 2 months later, it's sort of, he's doing okay, and the media attacks are a little out of control, and the left is, which is sort of true, incidentally, sometimes, and the left is indiscriminate in its criticisms. And 2 months later, it's, even some of the stuff he says, and maybe it's a little irresponsible. You need to say that kind of stuff to shake things up. And 2 months later, it's, Bill, you should stop criticizing him. He's doing a good job. And I mean, the degree to which people I know personally have sort of moved down that spectrum, for me at least, I'm biased obviously, is a little distressing and makes me worried about how much more they could move. If you had said to me 6 months ago, attacking the FBI, people I know personally would be kind of shrugging that off. Oh, come on, he's not really doing anything. I don't know, when he fires Mueller or fires Rosenstein in 4 months, are people, those guys, there was a lot of questions raised about those investigations, and he's the president, he has the right to fire them, and the Russia thing isn't really serious anyway, and I could see things going further in that direction than I would have thought 6 months ago. So I guess the short answer is I don't have a huge amount of confidence. I don't have a strong view either way. I mean, I think it's very much of a question mark whether Republicans in Congress, Republican candidates, really are willing to where that line is. There's huge pressure on the candidates. No Republican primary is, in a Republican primary, you're better off being at least friendly to Trump. You don't have to be a fervent supporter of Trump, but you can't be just anti-Trump. And the trouble with that is that if you just are sort of okay with Trump, in the Republican side at least, it tends to slide into a kind of legitimizing of him. But he is president. That's why winning, this is the huge, I come back to this always. We've had many, he's a demagogue, Trump, I think, is the simplest way to describe him. And we've had many demagogues in American history. And many of them have become quite powerful. And they've done some damage. Some of them haven't done so much damage. Some of them have done more damage. Joe McCarthy, Huey Long, whoever you like, but none of them has become president. I think that's almost a true statement. I mean, I don't know the 19th century presidents well enough, and maybe you'd make a case about one of them. But really, I'd say in my adult lifetime, certainly, whatever you think of these different presidents, none was as, detached from any sense of obligation to the institutions, to truth-telling, to a cause beyond his own sort of, his own prosperity and his own just kind of being at the center of things and his own winning, I guess. None was as detached from that as Trump. Nixon was a very complicated and problematic figure, but I mean, even he had a real, attachment to a certain party and certain ideas and so forth. And so in that respect, having Trump as president is really a risky experiment, I would say. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jessica Brand. We spoke earlier. I'm getting my master's in public policy here, and I also did my undergraduate work at Rutgers. I appreciated your response to the last questions, and I agree with you. I agree with your earlier analysis and your discussion. But I'm concerned that something that's kind of under the surface in a lot of this discussion and isn't being talked about openly enough is the real instance of the rise in hate crimes and in basically, I mean, acceptance of sexual assault from the president. And I think that, you know, it's easy. You talked a little bit about rationalization, and I agree with you for the most part. But I think that there's really a huge issue that's been going on. I mean, I have literally heard stories of women who have gone to the mall and heard men catcall them. A friend said to the other man, "Oh, don't do that," and they've said, "Trump can do it. Why can't I?" And then just this idea that the statistics have shown that the incidence of hate crimes has skyrocketed. And it's kind of under the surface, but I'm worried that it deserves more of a larger discussion and really to be brought to the forefront of these issues.
No, I think it's a fair question and a fair point. I mean, and this is in a way what I was suggesting when I talked about the institutions have held up well. I don't think people are being acquitted, let me put it this way, so to give you the precise, acquitted of crimes they've committed in most courts in the United States today, the way at a genuinely totalitarian or authoritarian society, if you're on the side of the dictator, you don't get convicted for doing something. Having said that, the institutions can hold up, but the overall culture and mores and climate can degenerate. And that's just a hard thing to measure and to judge, and people's experiences will be different in central New Jersey than they'll be in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they'll be very different in both those places than they are in Louisiana or Ohio, so in upper class and middle class and working class and a million things going on. So I'm a little wary, I guess, of overgeneralizing. But I think your point is a good one, that presidents matter a lot. This is like the point I was trying to make before, too. In that respect, you can have plenty of disreputable characters, movie stars behaving badly, celebrities behaving badly, senators and governors behaving badly, in all kinds of different ways. George Wallace, a horrible, racist, or at least pretending. I mean, it's hard to know how personally racist he was, but it was the path to success, so he embraced it, and it led to terrible things in the South. These Southern politicians irresponsibly embracing that in the 50s and 60s. Still, at the end of the day, Dwight Eisenhower and John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon even, and Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, et cetera, didn't embrace that. And so I very much agree that the president has a kind of unique standing that can lead to the kinds of things you're worrying about. Now, having said that, he is who he is. I've always I was on TV right after Charlottesville, and somebody, Trump's got to step up. And I said, he's not going to step up. He is who he is. Now, I do think, luckily in America, we have other leaders. We have governors. We have other elected officials. We have mayors. We have clergymen and women and, clerics of various kinds and university presidents and all kinds of people who have some authority. And they can step up. But I do think people probably should be a little more attentive to that, actually, CEOs and stuff. In that respect, but there's been a little, because with Obama in particular, there was a very strong president, may not be the word, but a major figure as president whom at least half the country very much admired. That was, and obviously we've had that custom for a while of maybe exaggerating the importance of the president. We almost have to teach ourselves not to count on the president so much. But I don't deny that. I can say that, but I mean, it doesn't stop the fact that someone says what you reported. I think race, too. I guess I didn't really mention race, so I feel I should do that, since you made it focus a little more on gender. But I mean, I do think it's a real problem, there's always been bigotry in America, like in every country. It's flared up. It's been very substantial and institutionalized for centuries, but then in recent years, you might say more that it's flared up at times. But it's sort of been denounced by decent people on both sides, and I think you might say kept under control mostly, and things have progressed mostly. I don't want to overstate this, but speaking very broadly. And it's a big problem, I think, that you don't have a president who's really contributing at all. Immigration, final point. So on immigration, there is serious policy. I myself have gone back and forth some on immigration policy. I was kind of liberal with Bush and McCain and those guys in 06, 07. I was skeptical of the Gang of Eight bill in 2013, and really just on public policy grounds of, actually, I will say on this one, I sort of saw that working class wages were not going up. It is true that if you let in a lot of low-skilled people, it puts downward pressure on working class wages. That's just a supply and demand thing. And I thought maybe we should cut back a little bit or restrain at least the growth of unskilled immigration. And anyway, there are a lot of other complicated issues. Well, what you do with the people who are here, path to citizenship or path to just legality. Anyway, there are many reasonable policy debates on immigration. But I do think Trump has poisoned that issue in that debate, which already, of course, was partly poisoned, in a way that's really bad for the country. And the kind of rhetoric that people now use, including people I've known for years, who are now on Fox and now write things, that's just routine kind of, us against them, Americans against immigrants, Americans against foreigners, is really bad for the country. And I say this as someone who's pretty conservative and believes in American exceptionalism and didn't like it when Obama went too far in the other direction and, was too sort of UN focused and citizen of the world focused for my taste. But really, it's not a good thing. I tweeted this morning. I was looking at Lincoln for his birthday, some of his things. So the speech Lincoln gave, he was in New Brunswick, as I say, on February 21st. The speech Lincoln, I just was curious, where was he on February 12th, 1861? And did they even celebrate birthdays back then, which they don't seem to have done, incidentally. The birthday is a 20th century invention somehow for people. You could look a long way in 19th century stuff and no one's actually making a big deal of anyone's birthday. Anyway, Lincoln on February 12th, 1861 was in Cincinnati, Ohio, as he took this train from Illinois all the way east. And he gives a very nice speech in Cincinnati. Cincinnati was full of Germans, still is, I guess, but is full of German immigrants in 1861. And had been a focus of the Know Nothing Party, which was a nativist anti-immigrant party, because there were so many immigrants. And the Germans, like immigrants from everywhere, took a while to assimilate. They were still speaking German. There were German language papers. It was like what people worry about today about Latino immigrants. And Lincoln says, there's a beautiful line in this speech in Cincinnati, where he says something very calmly, I think foreigners, I welcome foreigners to this country. We have more space than most people. We're a young country. It's great to have people who want to be here. He says it much more eloquently than I'm saying it. And he says, I neither think foreigners are superior nor inferior to people who are born here. We are all the family of man, and we should, in effect, he's saying we should have whatever policies we want to have, but we shouldn't sort of have moral distinctions because of where people happen to be born or what language they speak. And I tweeted it because I was so struck by the tone of what Lincoln said here, and the contrast with the tone. In that respect, it's just hard to know how much damage Trump does with the tone he adopts. The worrisome point of view is it could do a lot of damage. We've seen this a lot in other societies, and it's not so easy to undo it after, and we've only had 1 year, so it's not so easy to undo it after, let's say, 4 years. The flip side is, again, it's a huge society. Most 25-year-olds do not think Donald Trump speaks for them. Most 45-year-olds don't necessarily think he speaks for them on these kinds of issues. People are living their lives. It's an increasingly diverse country. They're not going to suddenly decide to become insane nativists or racists or bigots because Trump is a sort of a certain type of person from a certain generation. That would be the sort of cheerful point of view. And there's probably some truth in both, but probably the main thing is what other people do. And that's, again, where I come back to the previous question on the Republicans. The failure to stand up on that is bad for the country. You don't have to oppose Trump's policies, and you don't have to call Trump out every time he's just kind of a vulgar character or doesn't say something that's true in terms of facts. His crowd at the inauguration is bigger than anyone else's or something. But I do think the bigotry, the enmity, the denigration of people, that's something that other elected officials, should address. Sir, over there, yeah.
Hi, Gerald Pomper. Many of us think that the Trump movement began in 2008, and that kind of behavior was initially legitimized by Sarah Palin. And you had a good deal to do with Sarah Palin coming on the scene. So I want to ask you, do you want to apologize or explain?
No. Palin did not turn out as I had hoped she would. I didn't know her well at all, but I'd met her on a cruise in Alaska, and I thought she would be. Once McCain decided not to pick Lieberman as his VP, which was my first pick, a bold bipartisan pick, I thought you might as well roll the dice and pick Palin. But I will defend. Palin then went off the rails, I think, and a little in the campaign, but especially in 2009, 10, and then he just became a ridiculous celebrity person and ended up being a Trump supporter. But honestly, as governor of Alaska, none of these charges was made against Palin. She was an inclusive governor who had bipartisan support, who fought the energy companies, and had no nativism or anything like that in 2007, 2008. And the McCain-Palin campaign, I will say, and since I supported them, had none of this. McCain was a liberal on immigration. Palin was not at all right-wing on immigration. Palin had no problem. Her own family had its own complexities. She was comfortable with, the modern world. Again, whatever you think of her intellectual capabilities, I'd say Palin was a certain kind of dumbing down, honestly, of the, standards of the vice presidency. I think she turned out to be just less intelligent. It may not be right, because she's probably not stupid, but less curious and less willing to educate herself than I figured a governor would be who was put on the national stage. I mean, again, not that I was just throwing her name out on TV. I wasn't the one who picked her, obviously. I don't want to exaggerate my importance, but no, so I am disappointed by Palin. But I think this aspect of Trump, and obviously the misogyny, Palin has none of that. So, I mean, this aspect of Trump, Palin had really none of. And if you look at actually the McCain-Palin campaign, they had none of this to speak of. It was a pretty good campaign. I mean, it was a losing campaign, and it was never going to win after the financial crisis, but it was a perfectly respectable campaign. Look at the Palin-Biden debate. That's an hour and a half of Palin on stage with a capable opponent. She does pretty well, actually. She isn't great. There's nothing in that makes you think of Trump in 2015, 2016. So, I mean, I would stick. Now, as I say, she then went into a celebrity mode, and everything went downhill, and she went downhill too, so to speak. But, and so in that respect, I agree that she probably shouldn't have been vice president. I always like to remind Democrats that their vice presidential candidate in 2004 was John Edwards, so maybe they'd like to make an impassioned defense of his moral standing too. But so I take the point about Palin to some degree, but I honestly, and let me just make it more sort of serious, since you would appreciate this political science-y point about it, or I actually thought, one reason I was sort of interested in Palin is I had the instinct that the country wanted a more populist message from both conservatives and liberals, and I thought she was kind of anti-big oil. That's what she had done in Alaska. She was obviously a kind of working class, modest origins, and could speak to people of her in a race where McCain came from a very distinguished family and so forth. I had a sense that people wanted a more populism. And look, there's always going to be populism in a democracy, and the question is how to channel it and educate it. And I thought there was a chance to, and I thought this was true of the Tea Party too, there was a chance to have a kind of populism that was naturally going to erupt, but that would be educable and channelable in the conservative side into the Republican Party, and for that matter on the Democratic side into the Democrat. I give Obama a lot of credit, actually, for channeling a certain kind of dissatisfaction, legitimate dissatisfaction and impatience with American institutions into a much more patient attitude, in a way, towards them. And I thought that Marco Rubio, I would say, would be the equivalent on the Republican side. And people forget he was a Tea Party challenger to the sitting governor of Florida, who was supposed to get the Senate nomination there. So that all went wrong. I'm certainly willing to stipulate that. But I think the instinct that you're not going to do without populism in a democracy. And so you've got to figure out how to educate it and channel it. But that's, final point, and I don't want to go, it's a fair question, and it's something I've obviously thought about some, and people here should make up their own minds about. There were plenty of elements that went into Trump that already were there in American politics, and that had been perhaps, and I myself would say this, those of us on the Republican side had rationalized them a little too much, to use a term I used before, coddled them a little too much, not called out people a little too much. But Trump took it all to a whole different level in a way that I think it would have been hard to anticipate. So the birther thing, I'll give you an example. This is an example about Trump himself. In 2012, Trump endorsed Romney. You remember this sometime, March or something like that, as Romney was going to win the nomination. And Romney showed up with Trump. and they had a little press conference. And I remember being on Fox and criticizing Romney. What is he doing with this guy? This guy is totally disreputable. He was part of this ridiculous birther movement. And, Romney doesn't have to politically show up with them, and he shouldn't do it anyway. Why is he legitimizing this guy? And what I said wasn't controversial. I think most conservatives said that at the time. And Romney, to be fair, showed up with them for 15 minutes and then probably, never mentioned him the rest of the campaign. So the degree to which the normalization of Trump, I do think, is at a whole different level. And the birther thing was important, and that does get to race. I mean, one shouldn't kid oneself about that, I think, that the degree to which Obama's being the first African-American president laid the predicate for the Trump campaign and for the Trump victory, probably, is an unfortunate fact, but I think it probably is a fact.
We have time for just one more question.
Okay. How about in the middle there? I think
Where exactly?
Yeah, you were there. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Didn't you have your hand up? I think you did, yeah.
Hi, my name is Sarah, and I'm a first semester student here, and I'm doing a master's in United Nations and Global Policy Studies. So my question is, you say that our institutions are very strong, but if, as you predict, Rosenstein will be gone, and then perhaps Mueller, or even if Rosenstein is just gone, does that mean that our institutions are still working? And kind of to follow up on that, do our institutions only work when people are close to power that respect the Constitution and respect our institutions? Will those institutions hold up when people close to power have authoritarian tendencies?
Well, I mean, that's obviously a very good question, and that's the question. I mean, that's the challenge. So I don't think these institutions can hold up against anything or everything. I think they've held up pretty well so far. I think they will be really strained if Trump fires Rosenstein, let's say. I mean, will the Mueller investigation go on? If he fires Mueller, will the investigation go on? Of course, this doesn't depend on Mueller. I mean, there could be another special account. I mean, Nixon fired Archibald Cox, and Jaworski took over, and it all went on. How much would people in the Justice Department insist on regular order, so to speak, in terms of the application of the law? Will Congress then be serious? I'm more worried, as I said, I think in answer to another question, than I was 6 months ago, that there's more accommodation of Trump than I would like to see, and I think that's where I do think members of Congress have a real responsibility. They don't have to call Trump on every stupid thing he says or tweets, because they're members of Congress. That's for me and others to do that, I suppose. But they have actual oversight of these institutions, right? There is actually a judiciary committee that is charged with overseeing how the Department of Justice is being run. They can actually pass legislation that would protect Mueller, or legislation that would, and this gets kind of complicated with constitutional separation of powers issue, but let's say they could do a lot. And they're not doing anything. And one of the strongest arguments in that respect, for someone like me who's an anti-Trump Republican, one of the strongest arguments for hoping that the Democrats win the House in 2018 is that there would actually be much more serious oversight. Now, I prefer most of the policies that I think that a Republican House would enact, but I've got to say the total failure to hold anyone accountable makes me ambivalent. So in my own district, I kind of like our Congress, and of course it gets complicated because who are the people, Republican members of Congress, who will lose if there's a huge wave? Not that I can control this either way, obviously, but who are the Republican members of Congress who will lose if there's a huge wave that knocks out 40, 50 Republicans, which I think is quite possible. Mostly moderate Republicans from swing districts like the one I live in Northern Virginia, she's a good representative, actually. She hasn't been particularly pro-Trump. She's been very good, Barbara Comstock, on the sort of Me Too sets of issues. And she's the one who's going to go down if there's a huge Democratic wave. The Trumpy Republicans are all in, deep red, mostly in deep red seats and states, and they're going to be left there. So the Republican Party, this is something people haven't thought enough about. If there's a big Democratic wave in 2018, the Republican Party in Congress is going to be more Trumpy, not less, in 2019. Now that's complicated because they'll also be nervous about what Trump has done to their electoral prospects. But it's a very double-edged sword. But I think, but no, basically you're right. No one, including the founders, including Madison, for all the faith he had in checks and balances and separation of powers and institutions and so forth, and Federalist 51, and the was the ambition of the person being attached to the the interests of the place and all that. I mean, he knew that you needed people, both the public and leaders, who were willing to take some risks and show some courage in defending both the institutions and the spirit, you might say, of the Constitution and of liberal democracy. He didn't think it would work automatically. And obviously it didn't work automatically, incidentally, in the first half of the 19th century, and we ended up in a civil war. And it didn't work automatically to stop segregation from being enforced in the South for 100 years after the Civil War. So I very much agree that the character of the people and of leaders is awfully important. Character of the president is very important. He's the most powerful and visible leader. So I don't want to be at all, Pollyannish about this. And I think it's worth thinking seriously about what you could do, apart from, in addition to lamenting, if you wish to lament that Trump is president, and lamenting perhaps the lack of courage of some Republican congressmen and the character of some of the cabinet secretaries, et cetera. It's actually worth thinking about what members of Congress could do, what governors could do, what the ABA could do, what judges could do within the bounds of their power to try to prevent sort of worst case scenarios from happening, where you get a sort of more serious undermining of the rule of law. I guess I still tend to think, maybe this is just too much confidence on my part though, that it's a pretty well-developed system we have here, and there's a lot of barriers to real authoritarianism. There's not barriers that are chaos and to arbitrary instances of authoritarianism, which could all add up to a pretty bad situation. I think it's going to look more like, I don't know if Argentina, I don't know anything about Argentinian history, having slandered Argentina here for a couple of times, but I suspect we end up looking more like Argentina than some, fascist country in the 30s in Europe. I don't think we're going to have a systematic, Trumpy people in every part of government persecuting people. It will be more sort of some arbitrariness, some chaos, but that's bad, and that could really be damaging to the country. I think you maybe mentioned that you studied international politics. I mean, one reason I've been always more worried, and I'll close with this, close on an appropriately gloomy note, about the foreign policy side of Trump than the domestic, is that however strong the institutions are at home, they're obviously not as strong abroad. I mean, we have an international order, a trading order, a defense order, a somewhat rule of law order, and all kinds of other things in international politics. But just by definition, that's much, much weaker than the internal institutions of the United States. And so it's easier, it seems to me, for feckless or willful or irresponsible or demagogic leadership to shatter the alliance system than it is the constitutional system. And again, come back to the point I made earlier, I just think people underestimate how dangerous that could be. And it won't be, and this is the trouble with international politics as we saw from 1911 to 1914, I mean, these things happen. It doesn't sort of go, step by step, or what's the word I'm looking for, incrementally. I mean, you just things get a little bit worse, and then a little bit worse, and a little bit worse, and then you sort of fall off a cliff, right? And so the North Korea thing's all very kind of amusing and bizarre, and we taunt them, and they taunt us, and we escalate this, and I don't even have a view about North Korea policy, but just, and we do this, and they do that, and they do this, and it's all kind of interesting, and then one day, there's a, God knows, some kind of exchange in South Korea, and hundreds and tens of thousands of people perhaps are killed. So these things are sort of, people underestimate how much work it goes into preventing bad things from happening. And I don't know what the margin of error is. I guess I would put it that way. You don't know ahead of time, the road is safe to be driven on at 35 miles an hour. You can probably go 40 miles, you can certainly go 40 miles an hour, or you can probably go 50 miles an hour. A little luck, maybe you hit the guardrails once or twice. 55, it gets pretty dicey. Maybe you make it, and that's what I really don't know. I mean, maybe we just make it. Maybe there are other people clutching the steering wheel. James Mattis is there. In fact, I mean, that's a very important appointment. And that's a good example of how weird politics is. Trump appoints Mattis because he thinks Mattis's nickname to Secretary of Defense is Mad Dog. Mattis's nickname, I know Jim Mattis's nickname is not Mad Dog. I mean, it's like a stupid media thing they invented 10 years ago. There's not a human being, I mean, he would kill you if you called him that, except for Trump, I suppose. He's a serious guy. He's at the Hoover Institution the last 3 years at Stanford, writing articles about civil-military relations. He famously was this kind of monk warrior who carried his library around with him when he was, went on to different places, and has, has read everything from Thucydides to, to histories of the Napoleonic Wars and so forth. He's a very sober guy. Trump appointed him because he thought he was some kind of, macho guy, which I guess he is too. But it's very lucky that he's there. And I don't think Jim Mattis would actually launch weapons just because Trump picks up the phone and says, I'm sick of this Kim Jong-un guy, and we got to teach him a lesson. Having said that, Trump's the president, right? And this gets to the point. I mean, how much strain can the system take from a president who either is, or to be fair to Trump, seems to be reckless? Now, maybe also that he's not as reckless as he seems to be, and that he's a guy who blusters and bluffs and doesn't really do things that are, look at NAFTA. It's the worst trade deal ever. I'm going to end it. I'm going to end it. I'm going to end it. And then it's still the exact same as it was. But, final point, what's the damage of blustering a lot about NAFTA? Well, the damage may turn out to be that a Trumpy nationalist is elected in Mexico in about 3 months. Isn't that when their election is, I think, in May or something like that? And you actually get a real deterioration of Mexican-U.S. relations, not because Trump ends NAFTA, but because Trump's rhetoric gets the Mexicans fed up with putting up with all this, and they elect someone who decides, well, why don't we just take on the U.S., and then you get a kind of escalation that way. So again, I come back to the point that I think it's the sort of inadvertent consequences of Trumpism that could be more dangerous than this kind of image that he's going to wake up one morning and just order something terrible to be done. So it's going to be an interesting 3 years. I hope I can come back to the Eagleton Institute in 2021 and we'll all agree that everything is fine.